Welcome back, I'm Ryan from Blue Gaming, and I've decided that I was finally going to do a deck tech, or a kind of why I chose certain cards, for my Talrand Sky Summoner deck that you guys have been seeing on the channel for the past several days. Now, first off, in choosing a commander, I went through, you might be asking why Talrand, and that's because I went through several other decks and I kind of narrowed it down to which one I liked playing the best, and there was a budget in mind. This Talrand deck came out to be about 17 tickets. That's how much I paid for it. It was a little bit more and it can be a little bit less, kind of just how the market is on that specific day. But some of the other decks that I went through were like Omnath, Locus of Rage, which is the red-green Omnath. I was looking at a ramp version of that. That one was turning out pretty good. I just couldn't get it to consistently do well. Then there was a Call You of the Vast deck that I was working on, which all Call You of the Vast decks are the same. But it was just drawing too much hate at the beginning of games. It was turning almost every game into a 3 against 1, and that wasn't too fun. So I didn't continue with that one. Then there was also a Brago King Eternal deck that I was working on, but I just didn't like the way that that one played out, and so that led me to playing this Talrand deck. So now let's go into some of the cards and why I chose them. As you can see, I put them in order of CMC and color. Let's start off down here with the lands, because it's the easiest thing to talk about. So for the lands, there's 34 islands, just because islands are cheap. They come with your account on MTGO. They don't cost anything. So 34 islands. I was going to do all 38 islands, but there's a few that I do actually need. Reliquary Tower, because you can end up drawing a bunch of cards, and pretty much every single blue deck in Commander should have Reliquary Tower. Then I had the 2 cycle lands just to smooth out draws in case I didn't have any of my enormous amount of draw spells. And then Terrain Generator just to get extra land cards out from my hand. And then let's move on to the artifacts, because these are also pretty simple. Expedition Map just to go get Reliquary Tower, and if I don't already have, well, if I already have a Reliquary Tower, then it goes and gets Terrain Generator, pretty much whatever I need. Then there's Soul Ring, which lets me get a turn 2 Talrand, which is always great. Then Wayfarer's Bauble, which is just more mana ramp. Then Cold Steel Heart and Sky Diamond are pretty much the same thing for this deck, because with Cold Steel Heart you just choose blue, and Sky Diamond is already for blue. And now we have the 3 most important artifacts in the deck. And first, let's talk about Isochron Scepter. This is going to be in quite a few commander decks. If it has cheap instants and quite a few cheap instants, then Isochron Scepter is going to be in that deck. This you can put any real thing that's good underneath it. You can put the Pongify, or things like Opt, or Brainstorm, or Abjure, or Spell Pierce, Psychonic Rift, as you saw before. Pretty much most good spells. Putting Counterspell underneath, it's really great. Just, you can put pretty much the things that you need underneath it, and then you can use those things over and over and over again. And then next we have Proteus Staff, which went down significantly in price after you were no longer able to tuck generals, which means putting generals on the bottom of their players' libraries. You used to be able to just use Proteus Staff to tuck an enemy's general, and then they couldn't use it until they were able to fetch it out of their graveyard. Well, not their graveyard, but their deck. But in this deck, you pretty much just tuck a Drake that Talrand gives you, and you get one of the 3 creatures, which are right here, which I'll talk about next. And then Cage Sun. Cage Sun is just great. Here, I'll put it up so that you can read it. As with the Cold Steel Heart, you're always going to be choosing blue, and this way, even an Elish Norn can't take care of your Drakes, because they'll still be 1/1s, as you saw in the video. And Cage Sun just doubles the amount of mana you have, which for a blue deck is just amazing. and that's pretty much just the best. So let's move on to the 3 creatures. Only 3 creatures because Talrand supplies most of them, and his ability doesn't work for creatures, so I wanted his ability to fire off from most, so I only chose the 3 most important creatures that I could find. So let's start off with Diluvian Primordial. Here, I'll pull it up so that you can see. You can cast 1 instant or sorcery from your opponent's graveyard without paying its mana cost. I would call this the weakest creature in the deck, just because sometimes you'll run into situations where if it's a more creature-based EDH deck, then they might not have instants or sorceries, and having just a flying 5/5 for 7 isn't exactly the best. A change that I could make, or that you could make, is changing that into Sphinx of Uthun, which is pretty much Factor Fiction on a body. You could change it to pretty much any large blue creature that you want. But that's the one change that I would make to the deck if I was going to change anything anymore. Then next we have Scourge of Fleets, which is also for 7 mana, and this just pretty much is a board wipe for your opponent's decks back to their hand, and then most of the time they'll have to remove some of the things through discarding, and so that just resets your opponents, and it feels really good. And then next we have the most powerful creature in the deck, one of the most powerful cards in the deck, and actually one of the last additions to the deck. And one of the whole list that I was working with in testing, this was actually a Sphinx of Uthun that I would switch out with a Diluvian Primordial. But I switched it to Stormtide Leviathan, and it's been working, as you saw from just the video the other day. So, as you can see, it has Island Walk. All other islands are islands in addition to their other types, and creatures without flying or Island Walk can attack, which just conveniently, these drakes over here have flying. So, that works really well. A lot of other decks don't have flying creatures, which I was actually surprised because most of my EDH decks have flying creatures, but it turns out that not very many EDH decks have flying creatures. So most people, if they can't deal with Stormtide Leviathan, just lose. This guy's pretty much a moat on a body, and it feels really good when you drop it. So now that we got the creatures out of the way, let's go into the cantrips and card draw spells and such. So let's start. We have Brainstorm, just the normal Brainstorm. This isn't too good in this deck actually, because you often get Brainstorm locked, which if you don't play a lot of Legacy, then you're not going to be able to, well, most of you won't know what Brainstorm locking is, and that's pretty much when you put those 2 cards back on top of your library and then you have to draw them. To have a so-called perfect Brainstorm, you would draw the 3 cards, put 2 bad cards from your hand back on top of your library, and then you would shuffle your library in some way. But because you can't consistently do that in this deck, then most of the time this is just a card selection spell instead of an actual card draw spell. And so it's a pretty skill-intensive card that just has a place in this deck because it makes a Drake. Then next we have Op, which is one of the simplest cards in the deck. It's Scry 1 draw card. It's a smaller Preordain, which Preordain is Scry 2 then draw a card, which is better than Opt, but it's still really simple. Then next we have Telling Time, which is look at the top 3 cards of your library, put 1 to your hand, 1 on top of your library, and 1 on the bottom. Kind of like also a better Anticipate, because you get to put 1 on top. But this just smooths out your draws and lets you have some card selection. And then I'm also going to throw Predict into this, but most of the time you're just going to be choosing some random card unless your opponent has something that reveals the top of their library. And that's pretty much it for card draw. The only thing that's close, well, nope, I forgot about these big ones down here. Opportunity is draw 4 cards. Jace's Ingenuity is draw 3 cards. Gush over here is draw 2 cards. Factor Fiction is reveal the top 5. Your opponent separates them into 2 piles. You choose one, goes into your hand. The other one goes into your graveyard. There's This is a this up here, Overwhelming Intellect, is a counterspell and a draw spell put together. It's a lot of mana, but you usually draw a bunch of cards. Then down here we have Treasure Cruise, which is draw 3 cards, and then Blue Sun Zenith, which is draw X cards. Then we have the final one, I believe. I don't think I'm missing any of them if I look over this. Nope, the final one is Recurring Insight, which is draw cards equal to the number of cards in your opponent's hand, which usually there's going to be a few. I normally draw about 3 cards off of this, and then it has Rebound, so you draw 3 cards again. So that's it for the draw spells. You put those in there just to draw into the counterspells, which there's 16 in the deck actually, and they give you Drakes along the way to protect yourself. So let's actually talk about the counterspells now. And like I said before, there's 16 of them in the deck. The first one being Abjure, which for 1 blue mana, and Sacrifice a blue permanent, which is usually one of the Drakes from Talrand, you counter target spell. Really simple and cheap. Then next we have Spell Pierce, which is counter target non-creature spell, unless an opponent pays 2. I've had people concede to a turn 2 Spell Pierce before, and that's a little early, but it gets the job done and it got me a win. Then next we have Swan Song, which is kind of like Spell Pierce. It gives them something with 2. It's counter target enchantment, instant, or sorcery. Sadly, it's not any non-creature spell like Spell Pierce. Sometimes I've wanted to use it on like artifacts and such, but it's only enchantments, instants, and sorceries. And the 2 that your opponent gets is a 2/2 bird, which can sometimes backfire on you. I've had to block a 2/2 bird to save my own life before at the end of a game, and that wasn't too fun. But on to the next one, which is Disdainful Stroke, which we're playing Commander. There's going to be a lot of high casting cost spells. Disdainful Stroke hits most of them. Then Essence Scatter, it hits your opponent's general. That's pretty much good enough. It also hits any creature spell. Some people say that it's too narrow because it hits any creature spell, but I personally like it because it hits any creature spell. Also, it's really cheap. The whole deck, as I said before, was only 17 tickets, so you kind of get what you get. Then next we have a Negate, which is once again any non-creature spell, 1 more than Spell Pierce, but it's a hard counter. Then next we have the original Counterspell, which is any spell for 2 blue, which you can't really get better than that besides Force of Will, but Force of Will is a bit more money than this deck costs entirely, so a little bit out of the budget for this deck. Then next we have Muddle the Mixture, which counters any target instant or sorcery spell, which is nice, but it's mostly used for the transmute, because it can hit any of these 2 casting cost things in the deck. Anything from Psychonic Rift to Counterspell to Essence Scatter to Disdainful Stroke to Merchant Scroll to Twin Cast, just hits a lot of good things. Everything on the screen, for all the way down here from Twin Cast up here to Psychonic Rift, all this stuff it can hit. So usually going to use Muddle the Mixture for his transmute. Then the next somewhat counterspell is Twin Cast. If I'm in a counter war with somebody, Twin Cast is another counterspell, although it's pretty much just copy target instant or sorcery. As it says on the card, it can pretty much be anything. If I want it to be a Fabricate, it can be a Fabricate if it's on the stack. If I want it to be a Rite of Replication, then it can be a Rite of Replication. If I want it to be a Counterspell, it can be a Counterspell. So it's pretty much anything I want it to be. Then next we get into the iconic 3-mana Counterspells. If you look in Standard at all times, there's usually a 3-mana Counterspell in Standard that is the basic Counterspell for that whole Standard period, and right here we have 3 of them. One of them is particularly better than the other 2, that one being Forbid because it has buyback. As you saw in both of the videos that I put out so far, buyback helps a lot, especially in the late game. But the other two are Dissipate, which is counter target spell, Exile it instead, which is very close to the one that we have in Standard right now. I'm forgetting the name of that one, but this is close to that one. And then we have Hinder, which is counter target spell put on the bottom of their library. Then next we go on to the two free counter spells of the deck. Because Force of Will is outside of our budget, we're having to use these two, and this one is Foil, which is discard an island and another card to counter target spell, and that one's better than Thrart, but Thrart we have to use because it's another counter spell, and that is return 3 islands you control to your hand rather than pay its cost. Which, if I had something to replace Thrart with, then I would, but because I already bought all these cards, then I'm just going to go with Thrart. I'm usually casting Thrart for 4 instead. So now we go down to the big counter spells. And those are Desertion, which if it's an artifact or creature that you're countering, then you can play it on your turn. You can counter any spell with it, but if it's an artifact or creature, then you can play it again. Overwhelming Intellect, which, as I said earlier, is a counter spell and a draw spell put together in one. Then there's Gather Specimens, which is kind of a counterspell. It's, as you can see, if a creature would enter the battlefield under an opponent's control this turn, and it enters the battlefield under your control. The only thing is, this is kind of bugged on MTGO. If I believe it was Raze, the white-green commander, the white-green elf commander that makes tokens. It was a game versus him, and he was putting tokens onto the battlefield equal to the number of tokens that he controlled, and it didn't say pretty much anything besides that. And then he was using the Resonator. I forget the name of it. It might be Sonic Resonator or some other card that lets you copy and activate ability. I played Gather Specimens and it wouldn't give me tokens, so I believe it's bugged on MTGO and you don't get tokens. But besides that, for any big creatures, then you get to Gather Specimens, and it works properly. And then the final one, the biggest one, is Spelljack, and that is counter target spell. If spells counter this way, exile it, and you get to play it. It's any spell. Instead of Desertion being just artifact or creature, this one is just any spell, and that's pretty good. And since that covers, so far we've covered almost every single card in the deck. Here we can go through the 3 kill spells in the deck, that being Pongify, Rapid Hybridization. Those two both put 3/3 green creatures onto the battlefield in replace of that creature, whatever creature you're destroying. And then Curse of Swine puts, you exile these creatures, any number of creatures, and you put 2/2 pigs onto the battlefield in replacement of them. And then the remaining cards I haven't talked about, all the cards that bounce things back to people's hands, which is Cyclonic Rift, which you're mostly playing for Overload, and that's when you're about to become really offensive and going on the attack. You can play Cyclonic Rift just to pretty much reset your opponents. Then Into the Royal, pretty much get any problem creature back to their hand, and if you pay the kicker, then you get to draw a card. Then there's Capsize, which is also an Into the Royal, but this one has buyback, so if you have enough mana, then you can bounce a permanent and then buy this card back to do it again. Then there's the other ones are Devastation Tide, which sometimes you can play this for Miracle, and it's actually saved me before for Miracle. I forget which creature it was, but had something to do over the course of the game. When it attacked, I drew a card, and so I've drawn a Devastation Tide off this and saved myself before. And then Evacuation is all creatures, where Devastation Tide's all non-land permanents, and it's pretty much just the same as Scourge of Fleets. And then other cards that I haven't talked about yet I believe that I talked about almost every single card. Ristic Study. As you've seen from the games I played, this just draws you a whole bunch of cards. Most of your opponents are not going to want to pay that 1 to get it, to not let you get a card, so you're going to be drawing a bunch of cards. Then the next card that I haven't talked about is Fabricate. Search your library for an artifact card. It's usually going to be Cage Sun. If I already have Cage Sun, then it's either Proteus Sapphire or Isochron Scepter. That's pretty much as simple as it gets. Then besides that, Merchant Scroll. Grab any instant in your deck. It does say blue instant, but because this is a mono blue deck, it's just grab an instant from your deck. Next we have Learn from the Past, which if you're going through a really long game and you put a lot of cards into your graveyard, then this just shuffles that back into your library and then you draw a card. Sadly though, this does not get shuffled in like with Elixir of Immortality, and you don't gain 5 life, but it is close to Elixir of Immortality. Then next we have Bynum Fossa, the only non-colorless enchantment, well, not enchantment, but the only non-colorless artifact in the deck. And whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you may draw a card. That's what you use for the most. Normally you don't pay 1 to blue to have creatures your opponents control attack this turn, because we have some pretty small creatures, and they usually get outclassed pretty fast for an opponent. But sometimes I've used the ability to end games faster when an opponent's just toying with me. I'll just use it so that he has to attack me and finish it, because I don't like conceding in games. I'd rather just play it out. And with the Bynum Fossa, they have to kill me faster. Then other cards I haven't talked about: Rider Replication. Put a token onto the battlefield that's copy target creature. If it's kicked, put 5 of those tokens. Fun little thing that I've done before. If your opponent has a Grey Merchant of Asphodel on the field, and you play Rite of Replication on it kicked, you actually just win the game, because it deals 50 damage to each opponent, and you gain 50 life for each opponent. And so that's kind of fun, but you're usually playing it on whatever the best creature is on the field, and you're usually going to be kicking it. One of the fun things to do is Stormtide Leviathan, because then they have to get rid of 6 of them, not just 1. But kind of had the same thing happen with the last game, but with that one I was using this card down here, Stolen Identity, which is put a token onto the battlefield that's a copy of target artifact or creature, and then has Cipher, which is exile it on target creature, and whenever that creature deals damage, you get to recast the spell for free. The wording on the card makes Cipher a whole lot more wordy than that, but that's just the simple way to put it. And the last card, the actual last card that we haven't talked about yet, is Blatant Thievery. One of the funnest cards in the deck, but everybody will go after you play this card. And Blatant Thievery says, for each opponent, gain control of target permanent that player controls. Just any permanent that they control. Land, commander, whatever. Just any target permanent that player controls. And you've seen it used in a game. I used the first commander game that I used. Well, the first commander game that I put up on this channel, I won on the back of a Blatant Thievery that was twin cast as a copy of another Blatant Thievery. So I was able to steal 2 creatures from each of my opponents. And that's it for this deck tech of Talrand the Sky Summoner. As always, in the description is going to be a more list kind of layout for this deck. It's a tapped out list. And if you want to look at specific cards, the only thing is on the tapped out list, I still haven't updated. I really need to. Learn from the Past is not on that list. There is another card on it. I believe the card is Interduct or something close to that, Interduct, and that card got switched out for Learn from the Past. Oh hey, I forgot I talked about polymorph. Oops. Really simple card. You play it on a Drake, you get one of your 3 creatures. Okay, so that's actually it for this Talrand deck. You'll be seeing it in more Commander games. Just need to play and record some more, and I hope to be doing it for a while. As I talked about in the second Commander game that I uploaded, I'm still working on a Darien King of Keldor deck. Still doing testing on that to finish it off, but that will be the next Commander deck that I put together. And so that is it for this episode. Remember, as always, I'm Ryan from Bluewood Gaming, and I'll see you guys in the next one.